Hey everyone, today I'm going to be talking about the rise and fall of the Milwaukee Mafia. Today I'm joined by Gavin Schmitt. He's an author. He wrote a book called The Milwaukee Mafia, so I thought it was only right to bring him on to talk about this topic. In this episode, me and Gavin are going to be talking about how the Mafia formed in Milwaukee, how they made their money, crimes they did, and hits that took place. Please don't forget to hit subscribe if you want to get more interviews like this. And without further ado, let's get into this story. Hey Gavin, how you doing, man?
Doing great. How are you?
Oh, I'm good, man. Thank you for taking out some time to come on my show, man. I really appreciate it.
Very glad to be here.
Well, Gavin's got a really interesting story. I mean, he's an author, of the Milwaukee family, of the Milwaukee Mafia family, and that family's not really covered. And I mean, it's really not. So, his book is definitely a history book about the mafia in Milwaukee. And I think the way we should start it, Gavin, is who was the first boss of that family.
Well, even before that, I actually want to thank you for the way you described that because you threw in the word history in there,
Yeah.
and that's always been important to me. Is that it's true crime, and true crime is like the sensational stuff, the murders and things like that. But to me, like I always approach it as a history.
It
So
is.
I'm glad that you used that word and
Yeah.
obviously the murders are a big part of it, but I love getting into kind of the times themselves.
Yeah, in
Um,
your book, you're very detailed about the times and places and areas and everything where it happened. So, I really enjoyed the book because you really are descriptive about everything. It's like it's like you're back in time and you're there. You know what I mean? When you get lost in the book like that. So, you
yeah.
know, but I mean, to kind of start, like I was saying, like we could talk about who the first boss was of the Milwaukee family and how he became how he got there. His name
Yeah.
was Vito, right?
Yeah. So as far as we know, the first boss in Milwaukee was Vito Guardalabene, and I always may as well get this out here early in the show. I do all my learning from reading, so sometimes my last names that I pronounce are going to be awful. If please don't send in hate mail. But yeah, so Vito came to Milwaukee in the very early 1900s, I believe 1903. And by that point, he was already kind of an old man. His children were adults, and he had with him a handful of guys who um, were like his right hand men. I assume that they were already a mob crew in Sicily before they came to Milwaukee because they were ready to go as soon as they got to Milwaukee. They hit the ground running,
Yeah,
and and Vito, yeah, already being kind of the older gentleman. I get the impression that he very rarely even left his house. Is the way it kind of seems. Is like he had his sons and his other guys go out and do the actual business while he sat around and the other Italians in the community, like you'll see this in the book, like repeatedly they refer to him as the king of the third ward. And the
yeah,
third ward is where the Italians lived in Milwaukee, but everybody called him the king. Like even the people who didn't care about mafia stuff one way or the other, they were like, oh yeah, Vito, he's the king. They just knew he had that reputation.
yeah. So I mean, just him coming from where he came from and having the crew of guys. I mean, he had to have been definitely the brains, of these operations and stuff. And then he had his men go and make the stuff happen. And I think that's probably be fair to say, wouldn't you? Because he's older, like you said.
Yeah, like I said, we don't know like 100% on these things because the mafia doesn't really keep very good membership lists publicly.
Yeah.
But it's my speculation that Vito is probably like uh, the captain of a big crew in Sicily, and he broke off from the old village's mafia to start his own group with his crew in Milwaukee. I have nothing to actually really back that up, but that's the only explanation I could imagine why he would have a whole team of guys with him already
Right.
from the start. I mean, unless he was already the boss in Sicily, but I can't imagine why a boss would leave. I would imagine they would stay where they've got their own things set up and running.
Right.
So
So
that's speculation on my part, but that's my best guess is how he comes over and already has a crew just ready to go.
yeah. So what was their early operations then when he was here then?
Well, the strange thing is in the earliest days, and I think this is true across the United States. I don't think this is specific to Milwaukee. Is they're like so focused on this very small area, and I find this fascinating that they'll run scams on their own countrymen, on the other Sicilians. So for the first 10, maybe even 20 years, they very rarely get beyond like a square mile or two. But like their biggest thing right off the bat is just extortion. Just how do we get money out of other people? If they're, successful, are they a business owner? Are they making more money than we want them to be making? How can we get them to pay us some of that? And part of this is done through what are now known as black hand letters. So not every black hand letter came from a mafia member, but there is definitely a huge overlap between that tactic and the mob.
Yeah.
Do you want me to explain what a black hand letter is?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, so a black hand letter is like they write this anonymous letter to, again, like a business owner or somebody who they think has money, and they say, hey, leave us $500 or whatever amount in a box under a bridge by this day. If you don't, we'll leave a bomb on your porch. And then what'll happen is either they'll pay or they won't pay. If they pay, that might be the end of it. If they don't pay, what'll usually happen is another letter will come, the threats will increase, and then that time they'll either pay or they won't pay. If they don't pay, then there's like the risk that the bomb might be planted and might not. Now, as you know from the book, a number of bombs were planted, but I think the really smart move that they did is they weren't putting bombs every single time. Some of these threats they didn't carry through. They said, well, we'll let this one go. And that was okay. They didn't have to do it every time. As long as you do it every so often, the people still know they're gambling with their life by not paying. Like it doesn't have to be a guarantee that you're going to get attacked. It just has to be the threat.
Right. So they definitely used intimidation. So that was their way of extortion. So eventually they kind of moved into their next racket was gambling. Was that what they went into, and then bootlegging?
Gambling's been like the mainstay. There's been like prosecutors on like the federal level have always kind of referred to gambling as the backbone of the mafia. And I think that's spot on. I think that's absolutely correct. That from the earliest days as well, still today, I mean, there's still guys getting busted, not in Milwaukee, but there's still guys getting busted for like video poker scams. I mean, it still happens.
I've seen that.
So that's just been the constant. Yeah, it could be as simple as a craps game in the back room of a bar, or it could be a massive race wire coming in with horse race results, and people are betting hundreds of dollars on a horse race. It could be any number of things. It's funny to me that the mafia, like, we're used to like the Hollywood version where everybody's wearing suits and they're making millions of dollars. But like the reality is most of these guys are like nickel and diming people. Like,
right.
So like these bets, sometimes they could be like $5-10 bets. And it's just because it adds up that it's worthwhile for them to do. But yeah, gambling is like from the get-go, they're already involved. In Chicago, we see what was called policy wheels, which were basically like the daily lottery. I don't really see that so much in Milwaukee. Not saying it didn't happen, but Milwaukee seems more focused on the horses and sports betting. That seems to be their bread and butter.
So how come do you think they chose to go to Milwaukee then? These guys like Vito and his crew.
Yeah, I actually kind of know why. So the way that like Sicilian immigration worked was that villages would kind of all move together. And in this case, most of the people in Milwaukee came from a little town called Santa Flavia. And so like if one, husband and his family came, then his brother would come, his neighbor would come, and they would all come to the same city. So there's a large group, like the vast majority of Milwaukee Sicilians can trace their roots to this one small village in Sicily. And the reason they picked Milwaukee was actually a screw up. It was a goof because Santa Flavia was a big fishing village, and they were under the impression that Milwaukee being on Lake Michigan, this massive lake, they could just come over and pick up fishing where they left off, which turned out to not be accurate. They didn't have a good comprehension. And I don't say this like I'm scolding them. I mean, how do they know? But
Right.
they didn't comprehend like the seasons in Wisconsin. So they come over and they realize there's a massive difference between Lake Michigan and the Mediterranean. But that's kind of the thing, is like everybody came from the same place. So like the Mafia guys, like it isn't the Mafia guys picked Milwaukee. It's just that that's where everybody in their village was going. So they just kind of went along with the group.
So you think in most cases with, say, Cleveland Mob and, these other short ones, Dallas Mob, these other smaller groups, you think that's kind of how they ended up there? They just followed their villages,
I do. I do. Yeah. I mean, when you're talking the major cities, like there's so many different places that everybody's coming from. But yeah, on the smaller end, you'll see that. Cleveland probably, Rockford, Dallas. Yeah. You'll see like a lot of guys that came from like Corleone, like famous city in Sicily. Like they all came over and they settled in the same area. Like wow. It's just kind of how that worked. And even just like the other Wisconsin city, Madison, which is like the other major city in Wisconsin. I don't know if your viewers know Wisconsin very well. So just to explain that, we only really have two cities. We got Milwaukee and Madison. And Madison, like they had a smaller community because it's a smaller city, but same concept there. Everybody there more or less came from one small town called Piana. There's like two groups. Another one came from San Giuseppe, but there's like, that's it. You were from one or the other. So everybody just comes over from one place and they decide where they're going to settle.
Right. No, I guess that makes sense. It all happened the way it did, and now, they form their groups and, hell, a lot of them are still active today, not as much as they were, but
yeah.
They're still around and they last hundreds of years. It's kind of crazy how those things work out like that.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So another way we can transition is talking about the counterfeiting. Back in the day when they first started, a lot of the older guys, you think about the Morello crime family in New York City. A lot of them guys, they were counterfeiting and stuff, and a lot of them got busted. And I think in the Milwaukee Mafia, Vito, did he ever get busted? I mean, in your book, I know you talk about that.
Like Vito didn't personally get busted for the counterfeiting, but we know that he was involved in it because when the counterfeiters would get busted, they'd get sent to Leavenworth prison. And lucky for me and other researchers, Leavenworth prison records are very easily accessible. And so like we can see who's sending letters in and out of the prison. And yeah, these guys are remaining in contact with Vito while they're in Leavenworth. So, there's no reason for them to be communicating with him if they weren't, somehow his guys. So.
Yeah, no, that does make sense. I mean, for them, how would they counterfeit money? I mean, from your research, what did you come to? Like, were they just doing like coins and stuff, or were they doing cash?
It's primarily coins. I'm sure that some guys tried cash, but it seems like the big thing was coins. What they would do was really very simple. They would have molds, and I don't know, like if people ever did this in like shop class. Maybe some people do it professionally today, but like in shop class, you'd make like a little shape in the sand. You'd pour the hot metal in, and you'd have a cool little trinket that you made. And that's as basic as it was. Is they would have metal that was worthless, but was close enough. It looked sort of silvery, and they could put it in a mold that they pressed in another coin to create that shape, and it comes out, and they have fake coins. And it's so rudimentary. It's just these coins probably look terrible, but at the same time it worked because we didn't have, today, especially with the bills, like they keep updating the bills all the time now, but the coins are so intricate. I don't think that they had to worry about that as much. And the big trick that they did is they'd have kids go into stores and they'd buy penny candy. So they'd go in with a quarter, they'd buy a piece of penny candy, and no one's going to question a kid buying a piece of penny candy. Like if it's a busy day at the shop, nobody's going to care. So the kid buys it, they get their change, they bring the change back to the guy. Now again, like this is literally it. Like they just made 24 cents. It's a piddly amount, but that's a lot of how it was. Like most of these counterfeiting things, they didn't go higher than silver dollars. I mean, these are tiny little amounts that they were adding up. Damn. But if they could just keep doing it over and over again, it apparently was worthwhile.
Yeah, and you think back then money was, not as, pennies and stuff were worth a lot.
Oh, yeah, and that's very true. I mean, back then a dollar really got you somewhere, but it just sounds funny that these are like the big schemes when today it would be like it wouldn't be worth your time.
No, and that is. I mean, I suppose in some way, that is like a smart way that they would do it is they would just send some kids in there and you just, I could just see them. You want a piece of candy? Go get yourself a penny candy and come out here and just give me the 24 cents. You're good. Go about your day. And we'll talk tomorrow.
Kids don't know.
No,
kids are just like, this friendly old guy just bought me a piece of candy. Cool. They don't care.
Yeah. Well, I know a situation where, this counterfeiting, one of the guys got busted and his name was Carlo Zaricone. Okay. In your book, you talk about him, kind of talk about that story about how he got busted, if you recall.
Oh, I don't know if so lead me on a little bit. Which one is this? How
he got busted for giving it to the wrong people, and then the cops raided his house and he got 2 years in prison.
Okay. Yeah, I see. This is we warned you about this in the pre-show here that I might not remember the details of specifics.
I know, and that's how.
But yeah, no, I don't recall exactly that. But that is kind of the thing. Is like doing the kid method is really effective, but otherwise, yeah, if a shop owner has a moment to actually look at the coins, these were not high class jobs. Yeah, and they'd go back and the police, or really the police were like the front line of defense, but this was like a Secret Service thing. Secret Service investigates counterfeiting, and they'd come in and and it was really obvious what guys were doing because they'd find these molds and like there's not a legitimate reason to make molds of coins. What would you do that for? So there's that.
And I know another situation that really stood out to me was, when John Hankovich was arrested for counterfeiting. Do you recall that one? His wife was, yelling at the police and, when they came in and raided his house. Do you recall that situation?
I recall a little bit. Yeah, you should have warned me that we were going to focus so hard on the counterfeiting. I would have at least skimmed the chapter again.
Yeah, well, no, I from what I got from the book, she was, they busted this guy and he went on the run for a few days and left town because he knew the cops were onto him.
Yeah,
and the police went and raided his house and his wife was yelling at him. I don't know where he's at. I haven't seen him. And she started scratching and yelling at them and. Eventually they found him and he's like, my name's not John. He's like, so he gave him some false information, but they still busted him. So I'm sure back then it was easier to say, hey, I'm not this guy because there's no identification pictures.
It was super easy because what were they going to do? You didn't have a driver's license. Most of these guys didn't even have birth certificates. I mean, and I don't know about other places, but in Wisconsin, you weren't even required to file for a birth certificate until 1907. So if you're so back in these days, if you were born before 1907, you didn't have paperwork, you didn't have a social security card, you had nothing. No. So you could say you were whoever you wanted to be.
Yeah, and there's no Facebook, no Instagram, or people's got all these pictures of
Yeah,
themselves in a profile of who they're with and where they live. I
yeah.
mean, it's
I will.
just
I will say something about the counterfeit. So, despite all the stuff I don't remember offhand, one thing I would want to throw in here at this point is you had mentioned the Morello family,
yeah, yeah.
and for people who don't know, I'm assuming this is your reference, maybe not, but there's a book by Mike Dash called The First Family,
Hmm.
and and he goes into incredible detail on the Morellos and their counterfeiting.
Damn.
And what I love about that is he got like the daily reports from the Secret Service of them doing investigations. And at the time that I wrote the book, I didn't have access to the Milwaukee version of that. And now those are coming out. Those have been slowly going online. So that's something I'd love to revisit
Yeah,
because what I relied on was first the newspaper reports and then followed it up with like the Leavenworth prison reports, which was great. Like it works, but I'd love to actually go back and kind of see from the investigative end, like just the
yeah.
daily reports they were filing. Because imagine how many guys that they were suspecting that they never actually arrested.
Oh man, there's
So
probably a hell of a lot.
yeah, so there's probably a lot of like behind the scenes stuff going on that never made the paper, and so that's one section. Like as much as I don't remember that chapter, I remember enough to know that it's one that I'd love to flesh out more because now we're finally seeing some of these records.
Yeah,
I
and
mean, you always could, but they were stored in Maryland, which is just horribly inconvenient. I'm not going to fly to Maryland to
right.
look at records for a day. I mean, call me a bad researcher. I don't care, but I'm not going to do it.
Well, they
Um,
make it. I mean, you would think that, like, you look up anything about these other crime families, like the New York ones, boom, everything's out there. But like the Milwaukee, the Dallas, the Pittsburgh, all them smaller ones, it's not. It's so much harder to come by any information on them. So like I said, when I found your book, I was like, damn, this is perfect.
yeah, but yeah, that's exactly it. Like most of the time, I'm working from scratch. So,
Yeah,
um, and I love doing it. I mean, the research is my favorite part of it. I love the research more than the writing part. But yeah, I if I wanted to visit every archive that I needed to visit, like it'd get timely and expensive. So I just realistically can't do it. So I'm
yeah.
grateful that more of Library of Congress, National Archives, that kind of stuff is going digital and online. It's
That's
going to completely revolutionize the way that we do some of this historical research. So.
so. Are you located around the Milwaukee area? Is that what kind of got you into wanting to write a book about them?
Sort of. I mean, I'm not. I don't live in Milwaukee,
Okay.
but I do live in Wisconsin, and like that's kind of the thing. The small town that I grew up in, like you couldn't really write much of a book about it because other than the people who live there, like nobody would care. Uh, and
Yeah,
Milwaukee's a little bit of a bigger market to work with, um, and the mob angle is always a more interesting angle to approach.
yeah, it is.
So yeah, I mean, I guess I kind of got into it that way where I'd always wanted to write. And it was a story I was like vaguely familiar with
Hmm.
that, and nobody had written on it. And that was important to me was to pick a topic that people hadn't done. Like I say this all the time. Like, I'm like, you know how easy it would be for me to write a Jeffrey Dahmer book and the Jeffrey Dahmer book would probably sell 1 million copies.
Oh yeah.
But I don't want to do it because I have absolutely nothing to say that somebody else hasn't already said.
Yeah.
So like to me, it's not about the sales. It's about how do you add to the conversation.
Yeah.
So the Milwaukee Mafia story was like, that was absolutely key to me because I knew it was out there, but that conversation wasn't being had. So I was like, even if it was a complete failure and flopped and nobody ever read it, at least it was out there. Lucky for me, it's done very well. But that was the key thing was like, I saw this story that I was like, this is so huge. Like there's so much here. There's so many fascinating pieces of history in this story, and nobody else has bothered to put them together. So it was ripe. I mean,
Yeah.
that's really what it comes down to. It was like when I had made a decision of what kind of a project I was going to pursue, it just sort of fit all the boxes that I was looking for.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you think like that, because if we don't have people that have that kind of mindset, then these new conversations, these new topics are not gonna come to light. You know what I mean? And they're not like you said. You want to add on to the conversation. Like, yeah, we could talk about Jeffrey Dahmer for hours and hours, but all that's out there. So there's not much more to say. But if we
Right.
want to talk about the mafia, we can talk about the five New York families, Chicago outfit, but like if we want to add more to it, we need more people, like you that, hey, I want to write more. I want to, expand on the Milwaukee family,
Yeah.
because there's a lot that need to be said about it.
And that's
And
that's even true of Chicago. I mean, so I don't know how many books are out there on the Chicago outfit, but I think it'd be safe to say that over half of them are about Al Capone.
yeah,
Uh, and nothing against that. I understand why they're out there, but um, I don't know if people realize that there's a huge history of the Chicago outfit that
oh,
still has not been told. I mean,
yeah,
it's
you're
and
right.
I'm not saying that like I'm not going to do it, but I hope somebody else does, because there's so many other stories out there that we always focus on like two or three stories always come back, but
Yeah,
people don't want to seem to go outside of that comfort zone and tell the other stories. So I don't
no,
know.
and you're right though. I mean, I like the way that when I did a documentary series, like a little one from my YouTube channel about the American Mafia. I did 11 episodes about 11 different crime families, and the Chicago outfit was my longest one. I wasn't even expecting that, but there is many different bosses, acting bosses, so many different things that were going on. So you're right. I mean, the Chicago outfit, there's so much more to talk about, but it's just finding it, doing the research, and going about it. But I
Yeah,
kind of I did want to talk about with you, the Milwaukee and the Chicago outfit connection, because in your book you did talk about a little bit about that with I think it was Joe Felix Aldericio, Joseph
sure.
Ayupa, that they were Chicago outfit guys. But I mean, was there more of a connection? Were they pretty close?
It depends the time frame. So it's kind of interesting. In the earliest days, there there was a rivalry and a friendship depending on how you looked at it, because uh, for people who don't really know like the Chicago mob history, here's the thing about that. Um, we all think of it as like the Chicago outfit and Al Capone and kind of growing out of Capone. But Capone kind of started out as like the rival to the traditional mafia. Like there were Sicilians in Chicago who didn't really like Capone because he wasn't Sicilian. Like he ended up winning that battle and ultimately, kicked off Chicago outfit as we know it. But there were mafia factions in Chicago prior to Capone. So that's why, so I got to explain that out front, because those factions were friendly with Milwaukee, specifically a man named Joe Aiello. And Joe Aiello was like a major, rival to Capone, but he was also like related to some of the guys in Milwaukee. So that put Milwaukee indirectly at odds with Capone because he was killing one of their cousins, like he was trying to kill all these guys. So there was like a rivalry for a while. Eventually, this all kind of comes together, and for whatever reason, they realize, well, we can't fight Capone, so we got to join him, and everybody kind of becomes friendly after that. But so then after that, about 1930, let's say, from there on out, yeah, it's friendly, and to some degree, Milwaukee is like the little brother of Chicago. It's its own family, but there's a lot of times where they kind of look to Chicago for guidance just because it is so much larger. They've got bigger banks, mafia banks to kind of draw from. You had mentioned Felix Aldericio, fantastic reference there. His nickname was Milwaukee Phil,
Yeah.
and he was called Milwaukee Phil because he owned a barbecue restaurant in downtown Milwaukee. I don't know if he even really lived there, but he had a barbecue restaurant there. So he spent a lot of time traveling between Chicago and Milwaukee. He ultimately becomes the boss of Chicago in the early 70s. And prior to that, he was well known as a hitman. He had a car that the newspaper called the Hitmobile. Like it shot smoke out the back as like a smoke screen for driving away. It had a rotating license plate, so people could not see the license plate. It would switch as they left the scene.
Serious?
Yeah, completely true. You can look this up. Like there's photos in the newspaper. Like this isn't just some weird story they made up. And he has a direct link to Milwaukee. Not only that, he had the barbecue restaurant there, but he's actually, he's dead. Was the godfather, literal godfather of Frank Balistrieri, the boss of Milwaukee later on, his firstborn son. So we know that there was that link there, because obviously if the boss of Milwaukee is asking this guy in Chicago to be his son's godfather, like they've got to be close, right?
Yeah.
So
you don't just do that for just anybody. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So there's definitely that strong link there. I mean, there's other overlaps between Chicago and Milwaukee because they do work together time and time again. I mean, especially later on in the Vegas years. But Felix Aldorisia is like the prime example of a very strong link between the two.
So what kind of crimes would you say that they did together? Or what kind of business?
Between Milwaukee and Chicago?
Yeah.
I mean, as always, there's the gambling. Sort of the thing with that is with gambling, you have to have what's called layoff betting. And that's the good example for this between Milwaukee and Chicago is, say there's a Green Bay Packers Chicago Bears game. Now, no matter what the odds, no matter what the spread on the game is, you can be sure that the people in Wisconsin are going to be betting on the Packers. They don't even care what the odds are, right? So if the odds are against them, but they win anyway, that's a massive payoff, and that could bankrupt the bookies in Milwaukee. So they have layoff betting, which means they then take a significant portion and they bet with their bookie friends in Chicago. Because, again, same situation. The people in Chicago, no matter what the odds are going to be betting very heavily on the Bears. So it kind of balances out. So like in the situation where they would go bankrupt, they don't, because they've got their buddies to work with to kind of like say, oh, you won that side bet we had. And they send the money over to pay it off. So everybody ends up winning in the end.
Right.
So like the gambling, that's very collaborative. Vegas later on, Milwaukee was a crucial piece of getting the Mafia into like the Stardust Casino and a couple others. And Chicago was along for the ride with that. They got a piece of the skim. Frank Rosenthal, who is famous from Robert De Niro's portrayal of him in Casino, he was a Chicago guy.
Yeah.
So definitely a lot of working together for the casinos. But yeah, just other odds and ends. There's some weird stuff. I don't know if this made the book or not. I feel like this one might have got cut, but you tell me. You read it.
Yeah.
but there was this really weird thing where they hijacked a truck in Milwaukee. They brought it down to Chicago, and then it was full of meat. It was stolen meat. And they unloaded it from one trailer into a second trailer in Chicago, and then from there drove it to St. Louis. So just there's that. Like that's a big part of them working together is hijacking and fencing. Because if you steal a shipment in Milwaukee, if you try to sell a semi-load full of something in Milwaukee after you've stolen it in Milwaukee, it's not going to take very long to figure out where it came from.
Right.
But if you steal a semi-load of something in Milwaukee, bring it down to Chicago, especially if you switch out the truck, that's like an extra step. But even just bringing it down to a whole completely different area, you can sell it more anonymously. So they would do this with each other. They would kind of, fence off the stolen goods in different territories. And sometimes beyond. I mean, there's situations where they bring it as far as Cleveland or Kansas City. I mean, if they really wanted to get it out of town, but yeah, just a lot of that. It wasn't like a lot of times where there was like they'd call up their friend and be like, "All right, let's go rob a bank together." Like there wasn't a lot of that, but just the cooperation of making sure they could keep things, moving and under the radar.
Yeah, no, I mean that for them, that is a smart business tactic because, like you said, they're not, they take a semi, with stolen stuff. No one's gonna know where it came from, so yeah, sure, we'll take it. They
Yeah,
might
I
even
mean,
not know.
yeah, there was a case in Milwaukee where they hijacked a truck full of Hershey's Kisses, which of all things, but they did, and they didn't bring it down to Chicago. They found a relatively nearby liquidator store, and they sold off the Hershey's Kisses through there, and that they ended up getting caught for that because it looks oddly suspicious when this store has a massive amount of Hershey's Kisses and they don't have the paperwork to back up where they got it from. So, so they ended up getting busted for that one. So yeah, it helps to kind of create some distance between the crime and like selling off the stolen goods. And
Yeah, no, you're right. So another thing we could talk about too would be, was the Milwaukee mob involved with the commission or any of the Appalachian meetings, Appalachian, however you say it? Were they involved with like Lucky Luciano and stuff?
Sure. So, as far as the commission, they didn't have a seat on the commission.
Okay.
I've heard that basically Chicago like represented a lot of like the cities kind of like Chicago and westward from there on the commission. I don't know exactly what the source of that is. I don't have a reason to doubt it, but I'm not sure what the source of that is either. The Appalachian meeting, now that's more controversial because I would expect that they would have had somebody there because they had people there from everywhere. I mean, as far away as California and even some of like these really small cities that you wouldn't expect to be there. But nobody was busted. And again, now I've heard things like, oh, they found that Milwaukee guys had registered at a hotel, a few miles away. But I've never actually seen where the source of that information is. So
where it came from.
Yeah. So for me, like, I would love that to be the case. I would love to be, because that bust, like, again, for listeners who don't know, like, this was like the biggest bust that kicked off like the federal government's crackdown on the mafia, because they found mafia bosses from across the country all hanging out having a barbecue together. And after that, they couldn't really deny that all these bosses knew each other and were kind of working together. Whereas previously, it was kind of seen more as a local thing, but clearly it's not if everybody in the country knows each other. No. But so I would love to be able to connect Milwaukee into that, but I'm such a stickler on the evidence that unless you show me an actual, police report or the hotel receipt or something, like, I don't know, because so much misinformation floats around on the internet that if I don't know where it came from, I don't want to use it.
Right.
So
I don't blame you. I mean,
yeah,
I could tell from your book that, that's how you are. I mean, you got to be like that though, or else, you don't want to, ruin credibility or anything like that. You just want to put out the straight up facts.
It's especially true for mafia stuff. I mean, it's just legends and myths grow out of anything, but the mafia especially, like, everybody wants to tell a mob story and they want to make it bigger and better. It's the game of telephone, I guess, where it's like, oh, did you hear this? Did you hear this? And it's always bigger. And it's like, most of this isn't, again, going back to, like I said very early on, it's not like the movies. Like, it's most of the time, it's not this hugely glamorous thing. It does happen. There are those mob bosses with millions of dollars in fancy suits. That does happen. But that isn't the vast majority of what's going on.
Right. No, I mean, there's a lot of different key things that are going on. Some, obviously movies and stuff dramatize it and make it more interesting.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing. Like, I mean, I want to be a party pooper, but like most of the low level mob guys, like they still have day jobs. Like it's
Yeah. That's how some of these guys didn't get caught.
yeah,
One of another key thing I really want to talk about too with you is the mobster informant of the Milwaukee family.
yeah.
Tony Gennaro. Did he say it?
I
Gennaro?
would say Gennaro. Yeah,
Gennaro. Okay. He was basically, he was kind of like, because he gave a lot of stuff. Am I right?
yeah.
He was kind of like the Sammy the Bull kind of flipping. Because what was he, an underboss, or what was his title?
I don't even know if he really had a title. I mean, he wasn't like a high ranking guy or
Oh, okay.
anything.
So he wouldn't have been a Sammy the Bull, but he's
No,
like just
not no,
he
not
just
on that, not on that level. But it's really weird. Like, um, I have a whole chapter where I really kind of talk about that. I believe it's called like Tony spills the beans or something. It's like the
yeah,
name of the chapter.
something
Um,
along those lines. Yeah.
yeah, and it's so weird because it just kind of comes up like in passing. Like this was never public. It never came out. This was just a part of a police investigation into other homicides that this guy kind of popped up, and he's telling them like all these things like here's all these murders that happened, here's these heists that happened, here are the guys who I think did it or that I know did it, and like he'll give them and some of it's kind of vague because some of it like he doesn't remember the exact year, and things like that. So it's not like perfect blueprints, but it's just amazing how many things he comes out and is like, I mean, it's at least a dozen major crimes. He comes out and it's just like, here's who did it. Here who were the bosses at this time and who they had working for them. And it never really went anywhere. Like it got buried in a homicide file. Like I'm fortunate that the Milwaukee Police Department has held on to some of these files back far enough because a lot of police departments, once it reaches a certain age, they shred it because you're not going to solve an 80-year-old murder. I mean, let's be honest, it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
But Milwaukee's really good about holding on to that. So I'm glad that they did because when I first saw that document, I was like, holy crap. I'm like, they didn't know what they had here. They clearly had no idea because if they would have taken that more seriously, they could have done some damage with the police could have done some damage with that. So
And he in this Tony, to give people more of a background, there was a reason why he wanted to start cooperating and talking because he was pissed.
yeah, correct me if I'm wrong here, but it has something to do with his wife leaving him and marrying another mob guy, right?
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
what it was.
yeah. So yeah, they messed with his heart, and that was a mistake.
Yeah, well, I guess it didn't go anywhere, unfortunately for the police. I mean,
Not really. Yeah, not really, and I'm not sure why because um, a lot of that chapter, like I explained what he said, but some of that like is me elaborating on it. Like that's not the police elaborating on it. That's me trying to like connect what he's saying to actual events.
right.
And I couldn't connect everything, but I could connect enough to know that the guy knew what he was talking about. So I'm sure that had the police investigated it in the time, they could have done even better. I mean, I'm looking back at it how many decades later. They could have
Right.
actually been on the ground and talked to people. So, and maybe they did. I don't know, but it doesn't seem like it because
There was
nothing
no
got
arrest or
resolved out of
anything.
that.
Yeah, there was no arrest or anything that followed his
Yeah.
statements. When okay, so when Vito say his
Yeah.
last name.
I say Gordo Labene.
Okay,
Yeah.
so when he was the first boss,
Just
when he
say
died,
Vito. Yeah.
yeah. So when Vito died, he stepped down or whatever. Obviously, one of his sons, stepped up
Yep.
and took his spot. His name was Peter,
Yep.
and he ran it for a little bit. I don't think he ran it as long as his father did. He?
I don't think so. Yeah.
So with
I
him,
mean, I don't recall the exact years offhand, but I don't believe it was as long. Yeah.
yeah, and so the family just kept going on. The next bosses. I think I may have looked it up online. Like the next bosses after him, you know, because your book, it stopped at who did it stop at again?
We ended John
Oh,
Alioto. The book more or less stops around 1960.
yeah, 1960. So after Peter, it was Joseph Amato, I think it is.
Yeah, yeah,
Joseph, and then Joseph Villano, and then Sam Fira. And Sam Fury, he was a Chicago outfit guy. Actually, I think it says they voted, or no, the Chicago outfit made him step down as boss. Is what I was doing a little research on with that Sam.
yeah, yeah. There was
You
some
recall
weird
anything
stuff.
about that?
Yeah, like there's some weird things going on in there where like again, Milwaukee's its own family, but Chicago had some,
They had
they
some
had
say.
some power over some of this. We see that where, yeah, Sam is kind of drawn aside by them, and then even later on, we see. I don't think this is in there because this is probably after the book ends, but like John Alioto was basically asked to step down to solve a dispute by the Chicago guys, which then gets Frank Balistrieri in charge of Milwaukee. That's largely because of Chicago stepping in and trying to clear up an internal dispute in Milwaukee. So we do see Chicago kind of
It's
resolving problems when Milwaukee can't do it themselves.
it kind of reminds me of the Gambinos and the DeCavalcante family.
Okay.
They kind of had some say so over the DeCavalcantes. I think there's a situation with one of the bosses meeting with one of the Gambino bosses met with the DeCavalcante bosses and just kind of told them, hey, you guys are gonna follow under our wing now, and we're gonna you're gonna kind of represent us. You know what I mean? But at the same time, they're their own family and stuff. So it's something kind of similar to that. With the Chicago and
Yeah.
Milwaukee, it seems like because the bigger families kind of took over and took them under their wing.
Yeah, I think that's a fair comparison.
With I think something that we could probably, let's see. I have two more things that we could talk about. The
Okay.
Scafidi family. These guys kind of talk about who they were because there was multiple of these guys. They were all mobsters of the Milwaukee family. Were they higher ups in the family, or?
I don't think so. Um, the reason that family jumped out at me and the reason they got kind of special attention in the book isn't because they were high ranking. It's just because it was like multi-generational.
Yeah.
And that always interests me because if it's just like one guy, then it's like, okay, you're the bad apple of the family, black sheep of the family, whatever. And that's, then that guy has to distinguish himself. Like, why are you interesting? Why are you worth really covering? But when it's like, and in this case, I believe it's like a father and two of his sons. I could be wrong on that, but I think it's
Joseph and Anthony. The
Yeah.
father was Antonio.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you. So yeah, like that's what makes it interesting to me. It's just like you got this multi-generational thing, and they're getting shot at. One of them, at least one of them, maybe two, but one of them's killed. And like, what drives this? This is what it's interesting to me. And I don't think I'd go into that in the book, but like, this is what makes me interested. It's like, what's the motivation here? Because, I don't grow up in this world, so maybe I just don't understand the mentality. But like, to me, I'm like, I don't see the appeal. Like, I don't know, like, oh, my father was murdered. I will also be a bank robber and break into bowling alleys and beat people with a blackjack and get shot at, and like it doesn't seem appealing. And I get it. I mean, I know that there's societal factors and whatever else, and it's more complex than just that. But it's so weird to me to see that like how much of like this mafia mentality continues multi-generationally. I mean, there's people who their father was in it, their grandfather was in it, and they don't even need to be. Some of these guys are doing just fine, financially and whatever else, but they, for whatever reason, they're brought in. And I don't know that that's necessarily the case here, but it definitely seems like, being raised in that environment makes you become more part of it. So that's like an interesting thing to me. I try not to get into like the details, the really like boring
Right.
minutia of it all, but like that's what drives me is I love just the really boring stuff and I like the systems. I love the interconnections between people
So do
and
I. I think
that's what makes like that family stand out. Like they're not major players by any means, but like this multi-generational across decades like family getting mixed up in this stuff. Like what causes that?
well, I think you see your father. I don't know. It's kind of like monkey see, monkey do. I don't know. You see your father do something,
Yeah.
and like, oh my God, that's so cool. Look at all the respect and all this cool stuff he gets. And so they're like, damn, I want to be like my dad, whether it's right or wrong. But it's just like, you see that, and that's where you're raised, whether your dad's a doctor or a gangster. I think
Yeah.
you just see, like, this is my dad. And
Yeah.
to you, it's
Yeah.
right.
I mean, I get it to a point, but
I know.
I just don't have that in me.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, because I think their father Antonio was shot in the head. I
yeah.
mean, that's what,
Yeah.
and then even his son Anthony, it looked like I wrote down is that he was shot in the neck and killed as well. I
Yeah.
can't remember
Yeah.
how Joseph died. I don't see that, but
He must. Yeah, I was gonna say. I think there were two, so he must have made it out okay.
Yeah,
But
yeah, I think so too. But yeah, it's definitely weird. But I do like the connections and stuff with the guys too. To hear that. I mean,
yeah,
especially with different families and stuff, doing stuff. I always
yeah,
find
that's
it
something
really
I've been going back just recently, and I did this like years ago, but I'm going back over it again now, and just I love building the family trees and working off of that because so much of this is like literal families, fathers, sons, uncles, and then there's brother-in-laws, and it just branches out. And then you've got the artificial families. You've got like people being named the godfather of other people. So it's like Felix Aldericio, not related to anybody in Milwaukee, but now he's part of the family indirectly because he's a godfather to one of these guys. So he's tied in. So I love just like it creates this network that's not just, we all want to make money and commit crimes together. Like we're literal family. We're all related by blood or marriage one way or another.
And that's what, they say is, it's more, when you do stuff with your family, it's more, you have less of a, you have less of a worry of them cooperating against you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's more loyalty and stuff. But
absolutely,
as you can see from the Chicago outfit during the family secrets, I mean, Frank Calabrese and his father, I mean,
yeah.
They did that. I interviewed him, Frank Jr. And
oh, did you? Cool.
yeah, and no, I'm just I listen to it. I don't judge or anything like that. But he explains it. You see why. I mean, there's a lot of crazy stuff going on, especially between these mafia families. So, I was never in that life, so I always make that clear that I don't judge any of them. I don't, because I'm no gangster.
Yeah, no, I'm trying to be objective. I have my opinions, but I'm really just interested in the history. I'm not trying to make a case for or against anything. So
yeah. Well, what'd you think? I really hope you enjoyed this episode that me and Gavin did today. The Milwaukee Mafia is a crime family that's not really talked about as much. So that's why I'm really grateful for Gavin and his book to lay out the history. Please share this video with anyone that you think will enjoy it. Please don't forget to comment any key takeaway that you got from this video. Please subscribe to my channel if you want to get more interviews like this, and I'll put Gavin's book in the video link description. Also, if you want to support me and my brand, I got t-shirts, hoodies, beanies, and sweats, all on my website. I'll be sure to put the link to my clothing brand in the video description as well. And one more thing, I'm going to be coming out with a documentary series about the American Mafia. Please check out this trailer if you haven't seen it yet, and if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe so you can be the first to get this when it comes out. Thanks again for watching. Now check out this trailer. This life is very twisted. You never know when it's your time to go. One day you're putting in work with someone, and the next day they're taking you out.
In our days, it was very quiet. Nobody ever talked about this. Nobody glamorized it. It was all like hush hush.
Not a glamorous life. And again, it's not what you see in Goodfellas. It's not what you see in Casino. Some days you were dead broke. Some days you had $2,000 in your pocket. It wasn't every day. You don't know anything else. You don't know what it is to go wake up 6 o'clock and go to work. Work? What the fuck is that? I wasn't going to work.
Even bosses get murdered in this life.
There was younger guys underneath him, and he wasn't doing the right thing, I guess. He was coming out of the card game, and unfortunately, a lone gunman came up and shot him 5 times.
People who knew me would tell you I like to use the bat a lot. If I had to shoot you, I'd shoot you too. I've done that.
This life requires many mixed personalities. You have to wear many hats in this life to try and survive.
You become 4 or 5 different people all at once. And you got to go home and be a dad and a husband. You got to go to work and do your job. You got to be out in the street and be a gangster.
Bonanno family is called Bonanno family because of my grandfather, Joe Bonanno.
That life there is done. Today you have to be legitimate today.
But you got to be an idiot to want to be a hooligan today. Jail time's now like 100 years for doing nothing.
Yeah, you'll be dead, in prison for life, or in the witness protection program.
I don't know anybody. Now, when Mafia turned their back on me, I know everybody.
There was the big flip of the Gambino underboss, Sammy the Bull Gravano.
Here he is, signing autographs in a restaurant on Mulberry Street. And we're supposed to be a secret organization.
He was a very, very, very violent guy. No question about it.
Albert Anastasia, he was a Brooklyn guy. He was probably the biggest killer in the history of the mob.
Michael Francis, his father, Sonny, was a really tough guy. But he really raised his son right.
If you want to see a gangster, that's Sonny Francis. And John Sr. don't compliment anybody.
This is a documentary series about the American Mafia. It includes 11 different crime families. Each episode is about a different one. The crime families include the Gambino, Genovese, Bonanno, Colombo, Lucchese, the Gallo Crew, Chicago Outfit, the Philadelphia Mafia, the Patriarca, the Trafficante crime family, and the Jewish Mafia. Please subscribe to my channel to watch each episode as they come out.